Hi, I'm Dwayne Duggan. Welcome to Remax of Boulder's video podcast. Today we have John Goodman with us again from Frascona, Joyner, Goodman, and Greenstein. So John has been a Boulder attorney for many years. We trust him for his wisdom in a lot of real estate transactions. So welcome, John. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Dwayne.
So John and I did a show recently on contracts don't enforce themselves. And that was pretty entertaining because, you know, when something goes wrong in a contract, there's no lightning bolt that comes out of the sky that corrects the situation. But one of the things that can happen when there's a problem is this thing called mediation. So we want to start out with, what is mediation?
The best way of understanding what mediation is to contrast it with arbitration. Arbitration is a process where there's somebody who's a judge-like person who both parties have hired to be a neutral arbitrator to hear each side's argument and then make a decision, and then that arbitrator essentially has the ability to impose that decision on the parties.
Right.
Yes, arbitration is binding on the parties. Mediation is different. There is still a neutral third party, a mediator, who the parties generally agree on to be the mediator. But that mediator is essentially a facilitator to try and facilitate a consensual dispute, a consensual resolution between the parties.
And so once they sign that, is that enforceable when it's a mediation?
Yes, if the parties do agree, if the parties agree, you know, on bullet points, shake hands, and then the mediation is reduced, the mediation result often is reduced to a more formal document. Yes, that agreement is enforceable like any other contract.
Okay. John, you and I go back quite a ways in the real estate contract world. When I started, the contracts were one page, pretty simple.
Yes, as you are often reminded.
Yes, one page. So, wow, I need a pause moment. Anyway, it wasn't that many years ago that they added a mediation clause in the contract. Why did they see fit to add a mediation clause to our standard Colorado contract?
I think almost anybody who's involved in dispute resolution believes that mediation can be a very useful process for resolving disputes. And if people can resolve disputes through mediation, it's better for a lot of reasons. One, they buy into the resolution, they're more likely to follow the resolution. Another reason it's better is it tends to be quicker than the alternative is litigating. Third, it tends to be less expensive than litigating. So those are the reasons it was implemented. What the question remains, which we can maybe explore at the end of this interview, is whether people feel enough of a sense of buy-in to the process when it's imposed on them through pre-printed language in a state-approved form.
Okay. And so what does this clause force people to do, or what are they agreeing to? I don't think the typical person, when they sign this contract today, understands what they're agreeing to in the mediation clause. So what's it make them do?
Okay, so it's important to have a sense. It's more accurate to think of it as it doesn't make them do anything. What it says, however, is that before they can go to the courts, before they can access the power of the state to resolve their dispute, they first have to go through this mediation process.
Okay, and so they go through that process and then it's resolved, it's all done, but if they don't get it resolved, what happens then?
If they don't get it resolved, and the language in the state-approved form in Colorado says that if they don't get it resolved within the written demand of the first side to initiate the mediation, if they don't get it resolved, then either party is free to sue the other party.
Great, okay. So I might have jumped ahead a little bit about, like, in the process there, that was maybe kind of the end result, but how does one start mediation?
Generally in a dispute, there is a proactive party. There's a side who has more of an interest in getting it resolved. So let me give you an example. There might be a situation where the buyer just does not show up to the closing table.
Okay, sounds like a problem.
Yes, and it might be a situation where in fact it's a clear-cut case against the borrower / buyer. The buyer sent an email to the other side that says, sorry, we just have a bad feeling about this, we don't want to close and we don't want to move to Colorado. Believe it or not, that happens sometimes. But the buyer refuses to sign off on the magic paper that allows the neutral earnest money holder to release the earnest money to the seller. The seller feels that they have a strong case. In this situation, generally the seller would be the proactive party, and the seller would send out a notice, a letter, to the buyer, an email to the buyer saying, we need to go through this mediation process. Typically, the seller would suggest 3 mediators and start the process. Hopefully the buyer and seller would be able to agree on a mediator. The buyer might respond and say, I don't want to go through this mediation process, in which case the Colorado language is smart enough to recognize that you can't compel the non-proactive party to mediate. So the language provides that if the dispute is not fully resolved within 30 days, not 3, 30 days.
3, 0.
Yes, 30 days from the proactive party initiating the mediation, then the proactive party is no longer burdened by this mediation process and can go to court.
Okay, now you mentioned that the seller in your example would give maybe 3 mediators to select. Where does a seller turn to find mediators? Is it in the phone book under mediators?
Well, what I would say to the people who are listening to this is sufficiently unlikely to happen in your life for you to waste brain space and figuring out where to find mediators. It's just like how do you find plumbers, property inspectors, lawyers, surveyors? Call your real estate broker. Real estate brokers have access to mediators through suggestions from your boards of realtors. There are professional mediators. If you Google mediators, you'll find more names than you had, more names than you need, and then the question will be like anything else, culling the better ones from the not as good ones.
Okay, and mediation in general, is there a downside to it, or what's your thought there?
Well, I don't think there's a downside to mediation. I don't think there's a downside to mediation if both sides buy into it. The question is whether there is a downside to this style of mediation where it's essentially imposed on a buyer and a seller by a state-approved contract form. What I would suggest we talk about before I talk about the disadvantages further,
okay,
is perhaps an example where the mediation hurts a party.
all right.
So let me give you an example. Something that happens from time to time is in a contract, it's negotiated that the buyer does not take possession at closing. Perhaps the buyer is supposed to take possession of the property 10 days after closing. The transaction closes, 10 days later the seller hasn't moved out. The buyer may call me and say, how do I get the seller out? Well,
Okay.
again,
Perfect example.
a bolt of lightning does not strike the seller down for not moving out. The buyer would need to initiate an eviction lawsuit. That's very frustrating to a buyer. That's a process that takes about 2 weeks. But that process then is further slowed down because before the buyer can initiate that eviction, the buyer has to go through this mediation process that might take as long as 30 days to resolve or not resolve. And so it might take the buyer quite a bit longer to get in the property than the buyer expected.
Right. Well, it's a good thing that most people do move out when they agree, but that sounds like a slight disaster with eviction process versus mediation time and such, so, wow.
Potentially, most sellers won't hang out in the property that
Right.
30 days plus the 2 weeks, but it gives sellers more leverage in those scenarios than is intuitive to buyers.
Okay, so sometimes the mediation works smooth and sometimes it doesn't, is the bottom line, right?
Correct.
Okay. Any other thoughts on mediation?
Well, the lingering question was, do I think this mediation clause in the contract is a good idea?
Okay,
And yes, I do. I think on balance, and we've had about, at least a decade's worth of experience with it, I do think it is a handy tool in resolving disputes, especially small disputes that tend to come up in residential transactions. So on balance, I do think it's a good idea.
perfect. John, thanks for being here today and kind of explaining what mediation was. I appreciate it.
Dwayne, thanks for having me.
All right, John, thank you. Dwayne Duggan, Remax and Boulder Podcast, signing off.